Hello and welcome to one of my live streams. I've started ever so slightly early, but maybe if you could help me out by leaving a comment to tell me if you can see and hear me clearly and where you're tuning in from. I can see there's a bunch of people waiting on YouTube. I'm just going to go over to the YouTube channel and see if I can see myself. I can, so hopefully that's working. Frank, hello from Berlin. Hi, thanks for being here. Good, and that comment is coming up in my thread here. So I'll wait a few minutes just to make sure that other people who want to join can get here, because I only announced this 2 hours ago, so nobody knew that it was happening. Bob, excellent. I'm going to be using one of Bob's masters as an example in this live stream. So great to have you here, Bob. Gent Lover, hey, all good. Excellent. Frank, it's all good. Thank you. I would also like to ask a favor. If you could like this post so that maybe it'll pop up in other people's streams, and even share it with something saying, hey, Ian's this really a cool guy, you know. I'm sorry, I apologize for that accent. That would be really cool, so that other people can find this live stream and hopefully get something from it. Who else? Hey, Ed is here. David is here. Nick, hi Nick, how you doing? Antoine from the Netherlands. Gen P Music from Denmark. Darko in Slovenia. Hey Darko, how you doing? Bart from Belgium. Where are all the Brits? This is the European crowd are with me. Maybe it's because the lunch hour here has ended. Never mind. Okay, so this is all going well, so I think I will start the live stream proper. So, welcome to this live stream. If you've been following me for a while, then you probably know I talk about loudness a lot. People have been asking me about it ever since I first posted about the Death Magnetic album by Metallica back in 2008, I think it was. And they're still asking. But these days, the questions are all about online loudness. Why doesn't my song sound as loud as song X? Why does the loudness change when I upload it? How do I know how loud it'll be? And that's why I worked with Metaplugs to develop the loudness penalty website, to try and help people understand this stuff better. But I still get these questions, and today I'm launching a new course aimed at helping answer those questions as clearly as I possibly can. But before I get to that, I thought I would show you an example that perfectly demonstrates where a lot of the confusion comes from. So this example was submitted to, so I have a few online courses and I have a membership site called the Home Mastering Hub. And one of the very active members there is Bob Ellis, who is here on the call with us, who I mentioned. And he is actually, I mean, he's been a member for ages. He's had a ton of success with his mastering, but he's doing a course right now where they were set a challenge to make two masters of something that they were mixing, one for online delivery, where they were told to hit a specification of -14 LUFS, and one for CD delivery, where the idea was to hit -9 LUFS. These are integrated loudness values overall. And he submitted, so every month in the hub, I do a live stream, a bit like this one, where I answer questions and we talk about mastering stuff. But I also do quick mastering critiques, where people send me in songs and I offer feedback about whether I think, you know, how they are, how they sound, whether there's anything could be improved, whether I hear any problems, that kind of thing. And Bob was interested to know my opinion, particularly of the CD master of this song. So thanks to him for letting us use his masters in this live stream. And thanks to Steve Dale, who is one of his, also on the course, for letting us use his song Church. So now I need to go over and share my screen. Oh, we do have some Brits here. Kev says, hi from Scotland. Gent Lover says, presenting Finland here. Why there's so many Scandinavians? Actually, I think the podcast is really popular in Norway. I'm pretty sure I saw that from looking at the stats. So I don't know. And CBK from Norwich. Okay, I grew up not far from Norwich. I know the city well. Welcome. Right. Share screen. And this is always a bit clunky because I have to share the whole thing. So there is the infinite tunnel of doom. But hopefully now you can all see Wavelab very clearly. And so these are the two masters, two versions of the song that Bob sent in. So the lower one clearly is the one that's at -14, and the upper one is the one that was mastered at minus 9.3 LUFS, I think, according to my instructions. And I mean, I've turned the volume down. I'll reset that so that you can see how different the waveforms were originally. But I'm going to keep that loudness difference there so that you don't get blasted by loudness. Because if you're watching this, you probably find that as vexing as I do. So now I will try and play you a little bit of this, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. So I'll play the CD master first. So this is minus 9.4 LUFS, but it's reduced down to match the YouTube master, which is at minus 14. And in fact, let's just check. Can somebody just confirm in the comments that you're able to hear that okay? That it's coming through? It should be. I guess it might take a minute or two for that reply to come through. Andrew from Wirral and Lee from Oxford. Okay, and Lorenzo. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And while I just wait for that confirmation that the audio is coming through clearly, if you guys, if you've only just joined the stream, if you would like to like the post, share it with other people so that as many people as possible can see it, that would be very cool. Kev says, yes, it's coming through. Excellent. So I will play you a little bit more of the CD master.
Church doesn't seem like the place that should bind you up, but I got a feeling that you know exactly what I mean. And I don't care what you believe in, you can't deny that the world can change.
So, I mean, I think you'll agree it's sounding pretty good. I was impressed with both of Bob's masters. You know, I always have a few little suggestions, usually because I like my bass. But, you know, that's in great shape, that master. And incidentally, I've turned it down by 4.8 dBs, which is what would happen if you heard it on YouTube or Spotify or Tidal. That's based on the integrated loudness. So now, as a comparison, let's take a listen to the minus 14 streaming version.
Church doesn't seem like the place that should bind you up, but I got a feeling that you know exactly what I mean. And I don't care what you believe in, you can't deny that the world can change. But what is it that is changing? Something beyond what we can see.
And that also sounds really good. I'm not sure that just listening like that, I would necessarily have picked out huge differences between either of the masters. You can see a huge difference up here on the dynameter meter up here. You know, that's giving you an idea of the degree of limiting. And you can see that the second version is up at the top here. So much wider dynamics because there's much less compression and limiting has been needed to get it to minus 14 as was to minus 9. So now, just to let us focus in on it, I will flick between the two so that you can hear that comparison more clearly. It'll be interesting to see whether this comes over on the stream, actually.
I got a feeling that you know exactly what I mean. And I don't care what you believe in, you can't deny that the world can change. But what is it that is changing? Something beyond what we can see.
That's interesting. I can hear it even on Apple AirPods. Hopefully you guys can hear it in the stream as well. I mean, it's not a huge difference. To me, the YouTube version, the -14 version, sounds a little bit more lively, has a little bit more impact. As you might expect, the version that was made loud and then turned down is more held in, sounds a bit constrained, and not quite as loud to me. But, you know, I mean, it's impressive that we can have almost 5 dB of difference in the loudness. And, you know, it stands up pretty well. It doesn't fall apart. Now, this live stream and my new course are both focused very much on online. So I'm not going to go off into a huge tangent about whether the CD master actually needed to be at -9. The question is, which of these is the right master level-wise to use? What was the right target to aim at? And Bob's comment, Bob's feeling, and I agree with him, is that actually neither is right. The CD master is unnecessarily loud. It's probably been pushed a little harder than it needs to be. And actually, the -14 version, it sounds good to me, but I miss a little bit of that, the kind of the thwack, the impact. You know, I think we all are familiar with that EDM style of drums, which, you know, I mean, it started out in EDM and it has now percolated through to, I mean, you even hear it in folk, but, you know, definitely pop music. The kind of, you know, instead of a drum going boom, it goes boom. It's kind of, it hits the thing and stops. So it's a very kind of, it's got a lot of impact initially, and then it's a very flat kind of sound to it, is the way that I think of it when I describe it to myself. And I actually think a little bit of that limited sound probably suits this track. You know, it's got that big bass. I think there's too much of it in the CD master, as I say. I really lose some of that bloom, some of that warmth and weight in the bass notes. I'll just play a little bit more of that so you can, if you hadn't picked that out, see whether you agree. So this is the -14 version. To me, it sounds like the bass on the -14 version kind of goes doom, 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 whereas on the harder hitting CD version, it's doom, 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 doom. It's almost like it's pinned, which it is slightly. So Bob's comment was, I don't love either of these versions. I don't think I should have been asked to shoot for -9, and I don't think it makes sense to shoot for -14. And I agree, because online, that -9 version is going to get turned down. The -14 version will stay exactly as it is. So neither of those is ideal. And actually, you don't often see different masters for streaming platforms. Often what you see is a super loud version for CD and clubs and everywhere else, and it gets turned down. So the -9 is the norm here. But in my opinion, the opportunity is to find the sweet spot in between. So if at this point you're thinking, okay, I've just watched 15 minutes of YouTube live stream and I'm being told it depends again, don't panic. I am going to tell you something useful. But I can't tell you, you know, the question that follows on from this, whenever I have this conversation with people and they're talking to me about online loudness, it's like, well, okay, so if I'm not aiming for -9 or -8 or 7 or whatever it is, and I'm not aiming for -14, what am I aiming for? And of course, my answer is, you're not aiming for anything. Don't aim for numbers. Listen to the music, do what's best for the music, and that will get you the best possible results. And we actually tried this on the live stream, the hub live stream. You know, I added in a limiter here and we lifted up the level a bit, and that let me tweak that low end of the bass a little bit in the way that I liked, my taste, I preferred. And Bob was kind enough to say that he agreed that that was something he could think about. As I say, I think his master is in great shape already. But I didn't say, okay, I'm going to make this -12 or -10 or -11 or whatever. It was just a question of doing it using musical judgments. And that is why I have created this new course, because I've done podcast episodes, I've done blog posts, I've done videos trying to explain all of this stuff. I've been doing them for years. And because I don't worry about these things, I use the strategies that I have always used, the musical strategies that I developed over my mastering career from long before streaming and normalization was a thing, and I still use them and they still work. I do what fits the music best, and that's what works best online as well. I have playlists of my stuff and it stands head and shoulders against everything else that's out there because of normalization. And remember, normalization is, you're going to hear it in 80 to 90% of the places you listen online. 2/3 of all music is being listened to on YouTube, where everything, all the loud stuff, is turned down. And then when you add in all the streaming services that are now using it by default, it's pretty overwhelmingly present. There's a few places where it's not there yet, but my prediction is that it will be. And people, despite my videos and loudness penalty and all the rest of it, people were still asking me these questions. And that's what made me realize I need a new course. I need to really focus in on this issue, break it down, and show people exactly what I do. I'll stop sharing my screen at this point. Kev says that bloom is the word. That's good. Oh, yeah, I'm just glancing at the comments here. Yeah, people liking the song, liking the masters. But yeah, generally an agreement that the version with more dynamics, the one that was mastered at a lower level, sounds better, which is something else that I've been saying for years. So that's why my new product comes in. It's called Mastering for Streaming Made Simple. And I've boiled down the process, the musical process that I've been using for my entire career into 5 simple steps. And I'm not going to give away the spoiler, but even if you don't get the course for anything else, you should find out what the acronym is that I use to help you remember those steps, because it's ridiculous. If you're a podcast listener, you know I like my ridiculous analogies. Well, this acronym is no exception. 5 simple steps that you just work through as a process, and I explain it as clearly as I possibly can, in as much detail as I can. And the final video in the course, I go through 3 different examples in 3 different genres and show how the ideas and the approach that I'm recommending to you, how it works for each of those songs, even though they're in different genres. I mean, they were mastered at different times. I just pulled them together as examples that I could use. And, the great news is, like I say, it's based on a musical approach. You make decisions that are best for the music, and then you go through this process and you will know at the end of the process, at the end of the course, you'll know how the music is going to sound online. You'll know how it's going to sound in comparison to other reference tracks that you might have. And therefore, you'll know if you want to make any adjustments, any improvements to it. For example, this song, it would reveal, okay, that one's super loud. In comparison, maybe it's not working as well. Maybe there's some adjustments that I can make. So it gives you that insight. It's not a recipe. It's not a complete mastering course. It's completely focused on this whole issue of making stuff sound good online, but also understanding how it's going to sound, how the normalization and the codecs and all the other stuff that happens will influence the sound, so that you can be completely confident about what you're doing when you upload it. So you don't have this, what target should I have to aim for? Should it be this? Should it be that? I don't worry about this stuff anymore because it's so baked into my mastering process. I know before I start how stuff is going to sound, roughly what the loudness penalty is going to be. It doesn't bother me because I know that it's going to stand up from experience and from the testing that I've done. I do still check because, I feel that that's part of my job as a mastering engineer these days. If most people are going to hear it online and 80 to 90% of those people are going to hear it normalized, I have to listen to stuff normalized and make sure that I'm happy with the way that it sounds. That's what I do. That's what you can do. And once you've used this process enough, you'll be able to forget about it as well. That's my goal, is to bring all of this stuff together and explain it in enough detail and with enough clarity that anybody can use it in any DAW and start getting better results themselves and start focusing on the music again rather than worrying about the numbers. So that's it. That's what I wanted to tell you about. If you'd like more information on this, you need to use that URL, homemastering.com/MFS, mastering for streaming. It's super focused. I've made it as affordable as I possibly can. Hopefully some of you might like that and might like to give it a try and might find it helpful. And so I thought I would finish off this little live stream by answering some questions. So I'm going to take a look at the comments and see what people have been saying. Bart says, wow, more separation in the -14 version. And Darko says, agreed. Kev says, not as held in, so to speak. I agree. It's, on the other hand, I quite, like I say, I like a little bit of that. It's -14 was, it's all a matter of taste. I know a ton of people who are mastering with -14 very much in mind, and their masters sound amazing. Pretty sure the last Tool album was -14 overall, for example. And I share those examples on my Facebook and my Twitter and website and things whenever I can. So it's not to say, that's another important thing to say. I'm not telling you how loud to master the music in the course. I give some recommendations. And if you use those recommendations in the mastering process, in my opinion, you're going to be in great shape at the end of it. But if you want to master louder, you absolutely can. The process, the Mastering for Streaming Made Simple concept will still work in exactly the same way. You'll find it more challenging because it's tougher to get stuff super loud without negative consequences, but it'll absolutely work. And if you want to master with more dynamics, that's absolutely fine as well, of course. Again, the approach will still work. You decide what's right musically for the material you're working on, and take it from there. So let's dig into some of these comments. Yeah, I agree. Gent Lover, the louder one sounds more dense, definitely. Quite a bit more dense, I would say. Ender is saying, my latest folk/poetry album ended up at -17 for better or worse. That probably is absolutely right for that genre. That doesn't sound like unless you're, who's the amazing kind of rap poet? She was at Glastonbury this year. I forget her name. Kate Tempest. Unless you're Kate Tempest, poetry probably doesn't want to be really in your face. Clinton says, the end is so far away. What's the starting point? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Clinton. Can you ask that same question using more words, please? David says, true peak limiting has never sounded transparent to my ears, certainly not on transients. Why use it at all if it's not as transparent as without? So we need to be careful with this, because in my experience, lots of people who react strongly against true peak limiting don't test it in the way that I would recommend. So the way that I would recommend you test true peak limiting is to put a true peak limiter on your mix and master it with the true peak limiter in place, with the output set at -1, which is my recommendation, or whatever you think. Master the song, get it so that it sounds great. I think if you then switch the true peak limiting mode off and flick between the two, you're unlikely to hear a dramatic difference. You chose something that sounded great with true peak. I think it will sound great with true peak off as well. But most people don't do that. Most people start from non-true peak limiting, master it so that it sounds great in that situation, and then turn true peak limiting on. Just think about what that's doing. If you have true peak limiting on, it's holding the peaks into -1 and you switch it off, it will let the true peaks, or it'll let the peaks go up to 0 sample level probably. Whereas if you have a limiter requiring 0 sample peak to begin with, and then you enable true peak limiting, depending on the limiter and how it's configured, you're saying, I need 1 dB less peak out of this signal, please. And that means that it's going to have to limit 1 dB harder. So basically by enabling true peak, you're effectively saying, give me 1 dB more limiting. And if you're sensitive about this stuff, and especially if you're pushing things hard, which lots of people are, an extra dB of limiting could make a huge difference. For me personally, I'm running the limiting right at the limit of what I believe is acceptable. if I push it a little bit further, it's too much and I need to find a different solution. Most people are working that way. So if you just say, oh, I'll have true peak limiting now, please, and add an extra dB of limiting, of course it's not going to sound as good, or of course there's a risk that it's not going to sound as good. So, I'm not saying that you've tested it in that way, David, but if you have, I'd recommend you go back and try testing it in the way that I suggested, starting from a true peak limiter and then disabling the true peak mode, because I do think that catches a lot of people out. I mean, another thing is that some true peak limiters will, if you achieve their results by actually lowering the entire signal level. So FabFilter Pro L2, for example, if you have a ceiling, is it called a ceiling? The maximum output level is 0 and you dial in -1. It doesn't add an extra dB of limiting, but it does turn the whole thing down by a dB. And that also will change the way that we think it sounds, even though the sound is exactly the same. So you need to be very careful making these tests. And in my experience, there's a lot of people getting caught up in the details of this. What else do we have here? Normalized Audio says Tony Monaco uses inline compression. He teaches a class. It's very hard to figure it all out. I guess you're using, do you mean parallel compression? Do you mean compression in the mixing process? Because that's, there's kind of two schools of thought on that. Some people mix without a compressor on the stereo output, and some people mix with one there. And those have very different results and can achieve very different results. So definitely, if you've been doing one and you move to the other, it can completely change the way you have to mix. So yeah, I agree. If that's what you mean, then that can be a big deal. Okay, Clinton says, the final mastering process is very long to understand from beginning to end. What is the first step to master, excuse the pun, when you're starting out? Well, so I think the first thing to say is, remember, this is not a full mastering course. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of EQ, compression, limiting, all that stuff. This is what comes after that. It's, okay, there's my master. Now, how is it going to translate on the streaming services? I have other courses that go into the whole mastering process from beginning to end. So you might like to check those out, Clinton. But as a first step, I think start listening to loudness and start loudness matching. Start measuring the integrated loudness of files and going, okay, so the computer thinks that one is 3 dBs quieter, so I'm going to turn it down. What do I think? Start matching by ear, because that's the time when you can start making comparisons. When you get skilled at loudness matching, then you can take reference tracks, reduce them in loudness to be similar to your mix, and start comparing your mixes with the masters and hearing the differences. And that matching the loudness will enable you to hear those differences very clearly. It's a kind of a secret weapon, I would say, of the mastering process. And at that point, you're starting to think like a mastering engineer, because you're thinking, okay, well, so there's more dynamic, exactly as we did with these examples, right? By matching the loudness, we were able to hear there's more control in the louder version. It's, it's reducing the bloom in the bass, but it has a kind of an aggression to it that maybe is quite nice, but perhaps a little bit too much. Suddenly we're thinking about mastering decisions there rather than mixing decisions, which is, are the kick and the bass the right level, or are the vocals loud enough in this section? So I think that's the first step. The other thing I could say is you head over to my website, productionadvice.co.uk, and click the mastering tab at the top. There's a ton of information there to help people who are starting out finding out about loudness to get going, hopefully. I also did a series of videos for Sound on Sound magazine called Mastering Essentials, which they're free, and they give an overview of the complete mastering process the way that I see it. So that might be helpful for you. Chris Baltazar, what's a good dynamic range? How long is a piece of string? Genuinely, it depends, right? If it's folk poetry, you probably want a very wide dynamic range. If it's orchestral music or a film soundtrack, you want a very wide dynamic range. If it's progressive rock, you probably also want quite a wide dynamic range, but not as much as a symphony orchestra. If it's modern pop, lots of people think it doesn't really need any dynamic range at all. I disagree. I always think there's a sweet spot. So, it's I think also we have to be careful what people mean by dynamic range. Lots of people talk about dynamic range as the difference between the peak and the loudness. That's what the dynameter plugin that I had there measures, the thing that showed, up on the top right of the screen. That's not really dynamic range. Dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and the quietest sections of the music. If you're talking about the crest factor, which is the difference between the peak and the loudness, my opinion is that no higher than -10 or no less than 9 dB difference is optimal for loud stuff. As soon as I start pushing louder than that, or the crest factor or the dynamic range lower than that, I start to question whether what I'm doing is beneficial to the music. And I almost always decide that it's not. But I mean, if you look at what's in the charts, I mean, there's plenty of stuff out that has only got 6 dB difference between the peak and the loudness. So it still depends. It's very much, I mean, that I guess that's a point. When people say how loud should I make the music, I mean, again, that depends, because it depends on your taste, it depends on the material, and it depends on your goals for that material. What do you want to achieve? What do you want to be as loud as the loudest thing in the charts or not? Are you concerned about loudness? Are you more concerned about dynamics? All of these are personal decisions that we all have to make and find the answer that works best for us. Normalized audio says it's like archery. You don't aim for the actual target. I was going to say, I think you do aim for the target with archery, but I think what you're saying is you have to adjust for wind speed and the parabolic shape of the arrow flight. So I'd have to think about that. I like my analogies, but that sounds like it might be a good analogy. Kev says, I've come full circle in the last 6 months. Sonic diversity at the source can have such an impact on your recordings, and then mixes, and then masters. Ian, what's your opinion on this? I think what you're saying there is that... Oh, I've accidentally clicked the wrong button and discovered a whole load more comments. Yeah, I think what you're saying... For example, if you have a metal tune that is very aggressive and very loud all the way through, it's actually a lot harder to make that really loud than something that's much more sparse and open. And that's a reason that a lot of, for example, R&B and hip hop, which, is often vocals, bass, a few keys, quite sparse, minimal instrumentation. A lot of that can enable you to achieve higher levels more easily. Just because there's more space for the dynamics processing to work. So I agree with that. But on the other hand, I don't think loudness isn't a goal for me. It's important to my clients, and in particular, it's important online these days, which is, why I've made this course, because people keep asking about it. So, but it's not the goal. I wouldn't kind of listen to an arrangement of a song and say, well, I'm never going to be able to get that as loud as I want because there's too much aggressive distorted guitar in it, so I'm going to take the guitars out to give myself more space, because then we're allowing technical considerations to influence the musical considerations, and I'm all about the music comes first. Yes, in the course I say you use technical elements and technical methods to assess the music and to understand what's going to happen, because online playback is basically a technical situation. Just like it back in the day, we used to have to understand how FM broadcasting was going to affect the way that things sounded, and how the cutting lathe was going to affect the sound of a piece of vinyl that you were making. That's the role of the mastering engineer, is to understand the music in the context of the technical issues. But yeah, I wouldn't let it influence kind of the music that I make. But I mean, it is true, if you have something that's a sparse arrangement, it's a lot easier to make it super loud. I don't know whether that was what you were meaning. Frank, I like -14 a lot in this track. For me as a beginning composer, it would be interesting to know how much LUFS I should aim for in my trailer music online portfolio. Thanks in advance. Frank, I think you should try the Mastering for Streaming Made Simple course, which you can find more details at this link here. Because there is no one number, but there is a technique and a strategy to help you find out what the number should be. And that's exactly what this course is designed to help people do. So I really think you should give it a try. I can't explain it all in the remaining 10 minutes of this live stream, but it is all explained in that course, hopefully. Normalized Audio says, True Peak is fun to mess with. You can use it instead of LUFS. Well, you can and you can't. You can use it in the sense that if something is peaking at -1 LUFS and you turn it down so that it's peaking at -2 LUFS, you know that one of them is 1 dB louder than the other. But if you try comparing, for example, a snare hit, which has a huge spike and then a much smaller decay at the beginning of it, if you compare that snare hit with a flute, which basically has a little t at the start, a little transient, and then is a very smooth, sustained sound. So you've got your snare here and your flute here. If you increase the flute so that the peak level matches the snare, it will actually sound incredibly loud in comparison to the snare. And if you squash this, turn the snare down, not squash it, if you reduce the level down so that it has the same peak level as the flute, it will sound ridiculously quiet. I actually do that exact demonstration in the videos that I mentioned, the Sound on Sound videos. So I recommend anybody, if I realize this is not the clearest way to explain that to people, so I strongly recommend you take a look. So peak level is not, you can use it to compare the relative loudness of two things that are different, that are the same. So if you have one thing that's peaking at one level and one thing, I mean, even then you can't, because it depends how the difference in peak level was achieved. I have to say a peak level, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty much useless for loudness. You know, very crude indications. You know, like looking at those waveforms in Wavelab, we could see which one of those was the louder, which one had been pushed harder. But I also have masters that look quite similar to the louder version there that don't sound anywhere near as heavily pushed. So peak level is very deceptive. I think we have to be careful. David says he's going to give it a go. I don't know whether you mean the course, David, or one of the other things that I've mentioned in the Q&A, but either way, great. Let me know if you have any questions. Sigurdor, who's also has been a member of the Home Mastering Masterclass, a long-time friend of Production Advice, and is now a very accomplished mastering engineer in his own right, says, I think the dislike that many have for True Peak limiters is exactly what you've just described with FabFilter Pro L2. You mean the fact that you reduce the threshold to -1 and the overall signal level goes down? That might be the case. Because the trouble is -1 is a small enough change, well, 1 dB is a small enough change that it doesn't necessarily leap out at you as being a loudness change, but it's definitely audible. It definitely has an influence on the way that we hear things. So, yeah. Lorenzo, besides all your sacrosanct considerations on loudness, I usually take Spotify loud specs -11 LUFS in order not to allow Spotify to use limiters. Is it a sensible practice? Any better practices? I'm mixing an extremely dynamic solo cello record and I'm a bit frightened about Spotify manipulations, so to speak. That's a really good question. So let me just go into that in a little bit more detail for people who aren't aware of it. So Spotify, all of the online streaming services, Spotify, YouTube, Tidal, Pandora, Deezer, Amazon, all use normalization by default these days. Most of them use LUFS. Most of them are at -14 LUFS. Apple Music is at -16. And here's an important point: people don't jump between Apple Music and Spotify. I don't think it really matters that there's that difference. It's just important to know what the level is so that you can make these comparisons that we're talking about and make sure you're getting results you're happy with. However, Spotify, if you go into the preferences, has two other options. So the default, the normal, is -14. There is also a quiet setting for listening in quiet listening environments, which is down at -23, which is the same as broadcast, TV and film. And there is a loud setting at -11 that's intended for listening in noisy environments. So you can crank the volume on your phone or your player higher. If somebody chooses the -11 setting, the loud setting in Spotify, and Spotify is the only platform that does this, then the level will be increased and they will use a limiter if they need to achieve that. So if your song was at -14 and peaking at -1 and you turned it up to -11, you'd get 2 dBs of extra limiting added by Spotify, and it's not the best limiter in the world. So that's what Lorenzo is concerned about, and I understand that concern. Whether it's a sensible practice to therefore say, okay, I'm going to master at -11 in order to make sure that if that or that won't happen, because if it's already at -11, then Spotify doesn't need to turn it up and doesn't need to apply any limiting. Not for me, Lorenzo, for the reasons that I mentioned. So 60% at least, up to 75% of all music heard online is on the YouTube video platform, not YouTube audio, YouTube video. That's where 60% plus of people are listening to music. And that doesn't turn quiet stuff up at all. And it certainly doesn't use limiting. Out of the others, Spotify is, I think, roughly a third, maybe. Spotify is the next most popular platform for sure. And of course, they do have this setting. But I've been told, off the record, that the less than 17% of Spotify users change the loudness preferences at all. Okay? So it's enabled by default, it's -14 by default, and less than 17% of people change that in any way. So 83% plus of Spotify users are listening with -14 loudness normalization on. Out of that 17% who change those settings, my guess is that most are musicians and engineers like us who turn it off. And that's a funny, one of the common objections I get to now normalization is people saying, nobody I know uses now loudness normalization. They all turn it off. That's because we and everybody we know are music nuts and artists and engineers, and we're obsessed with this stuff. Normal people, normal music fans out there in the world don't know about this stuff, don't care, never changed that setting. So, I mean, I don't know what the proportion is, but less than 17% of people. And how many of that 17% of the Spotify users who are already only 1/3 of the 1/3 of, so only 1/9 maybe of the total audience or something? I should probably work out that exact statistic. How many of them choose the loud setting? I don't know. But I feel like it's such a small number of people that I don't care. Which, and that sounds harsh, but I mean, what I mean is it's not worth compromise. Like you're talking about an extremely dynamic cello recording. I don't think it'd be worth compromising the musical, what's best for the music, because of that concern about that tiny number of people who change that preference in Spotify. It's probably worth previewing it at -14 and making sure that it's loud enough in that situation, because that's so widespread. But probably that's going to work out okay for you, depending on what type of material it is. I mean, another thing is that people expect, if that sounds like a classical piece, people probably expect classical material to sound quieter anyway. But another thing, the reason I say that I don't worry about it is that anybody who's got that -11 setting enabled is going to be hearing that all the time. On anything that started out lower than -11, they're going to be hearing that Spotify limiter. They're used to it. They obviously don't object to it that much. So they probably won't object to it on this music either. So yeah, my opinion is I don't cater for that niche, because I do think it's small enough to not be of genuine concern. But you may feel differently. I mean, it all depends. If there might well be situations where you know that the majority of people are going to listen to it in Spotify with that setting enabled, and therefore you want to kind of cater for that. I mean, I would say -11 is still not intensely loud by modern standards. A lot of the loudest stuff I master is at -11, so that's all fine. But that's the loudest songs. Over an album with a variety of material, I might well have several songs that are lower, and I wouldn't want to turn those up because of that Spotify setting, especially since YouTube and Tidal and Amazon don't turn quiet songs up at all either. So, we have the real opportunity there to preserve the original musical balances. B1 O'Wire. Wow, the comments are still coming in. I may just have to draw a line under this and try and reply to some of you on social media afterwards, but I'll keep and do a few. B1 O'Wire. Could you hard clip the tips of the transients only before the limiter, say by 0.5 dB or similarly tiny amount, to reduce the work of the limiter, or maybe do that upstream in the mix? I mean, with the recommendations that I'm making, I don't use limiting hard enough that I think that will make a huge amount of difference. I've heard people say that. I saw one video of somebody going in and reducing some of the transients by hand to get themselves an extra half. what's half a dB between friends? Maybe, I don't know. I haven't experimented with that sufficiently. I prefer to simply, for me, the musical decisions that I feel hit the sweet spot that I was talking about don't require extreme limiting. I sometimes have problems where I'm hearing too much limiting and I'm not happy about it, but it's rare. Most of the time I'm completely comfortable with the amount of limiting I'm doing, and I don't feel that tricks like that are necessary. Clinton says, what are your thoughts on testing masters in mono versus stereo? I typically listen in stereo most of the time, and I check by flicking mono. I don't master in mono. I check in mono. I mean, actually, the monitoring I have is sufficiently high quality that if there's something out of phase or in anti-phase, or it jumps out at me when I hear the music. So, and then I just use the mono button to confirm, or maybe a mid-side preview just to double check. But it's more a case of confirmation rather than affecting my decision-making process. If I hear that there's something where there's a problem with the stereo image is too wide, I would typically pass that back to the client as a comment and see what they do. And if there are opportunities where they can't change the mix, or they don't want to change the mix, then there's some stuff that you can do with, multi-band stereo width processing or mid-side EQ to individually control certain frequency ranges and deal with that stuff. But I would only do it if I thought it was going to be some kind of problem. I mean, there's lots of records out there that have very wide stereo images, sound, wider than I would make them, but they're really popular and people love them and nobody ever complains. So, it's something I check, but not something that I obsess about. Kev, I cannot recommend Ian's Mastering Essentials videos enough. Thank you. That's very kind of you. I'm really pleased you found them helpful. And Sigador makes a point, which is that the limiter setting on the loud normalization in Spotify is set at -1 true peak. Or is it sample peak? I forget. But anyway, so it's not only is it not a great limiter, but it's quite aggressive limiting. So yeah, if you have, like I say, if you have something where there's a genuine concern that it's going to be hitting that limiter, then it might be worth taking into account. But I don't, in the same way that I don't feel it's worth compromising the quality of our audio because it's going to be listened to on earbuds or on low bandwidth mobile phone streams, any of that kind of stuff. I'm not going to, it's got to be a fraction of I'll have to do that calculation and figure out what a small percentage it is of, well, I don't know because I'm guessing, but it's less than 17% of 30% of 30%. So less than 17% of 1/9. It's not very many people. So Thomas is saying always off. I assume you mean normalization always off. Well, fair enough. Just understand that that's not how most people listen to music. Lee says, I find that in most cases, providing the loudest section of the song doesn't go much above -10 short term, you'll be in pretty good shape in terms of loudness and dynamics. That's interesting, Lee. I wonder where you came across that opinion. Kev, I have mastered a binaural mix. I did one recently, but it was acoustic guitar in a church. So actually, I didn't master it. I was a consultant for the mastering process. And it was down at -18, but it was classical. So, that's a different kind of thing, really. Okay, I think we've been going almost an hour, so I think we're going to wrap this up soon. Lorenzo says, thank you very much, Sigador and Ian. You're welcome. Okay, I have to address that one. The Spotify loudness specifications are not -2 for true peak. Okay, Spotify doesn't have any specifications for true peak. They recommend -1 true peak because when a piece of audio is encoded to a lossy codec, if there are peaks that are high, they get preserved. But the audio, gets reduced in file size by 90% as part of that process. And when it's decoded at the end, the peak levels change. They just do. The music sounds remarkably similar considering how much of it we've thrown away or the data we've thrown away, but the peak levels will change. And that means you can have something that was peaking at 0 going in can peak at -1, 2, 3, even higher coming out. And there is a risk that will get clipped on a lot of the most popular players, and theoretically could add extra distortion to the signal. So Spotify recommend -1 if you're mastering at -14 or below, true peak. And in my experience as well, at that kind of level, you're not going to get problems with decoder clipping. They suggest -2 if you're going above -14. I think that's unnecessarily conservative. I regularly master really loud stuff at -11, for example, with my true peaks at -1, and I'm not hearing problems with the decoded streams. I'm not seeing problems with the decoded streams. You might get the odd true peak, but you know, that's not going to be audible. If you're constantly pushing up +1, +2, +3 when a stream is decoded, that could be an issue. But the odd peak here and there is not something to lose sleep about. So they're recommendations, not specs, on Spotify, and I think they're unnecessarily conservative. I would say anything up to -11 LUFS, -1 is probably fine. After that, yes, you're in this weird situation of you push the music louder, which means that the decoder peaks will also get bigger, which means that actually you need to restrict the peak level going in more to prevent the risk of that happening. So you're squashing it even more, and you know, this is where I start getting into the, you know, what was the point of making it that loud in the first place, since it's going to get turned down again afterwards? You know, but you've got to be far beyond what I consider to be the sweet spot for that to start becoming an issue. So yeah, I just want to address that. Oh, and I see that Sigador has already explained that for me, so I didn't need to go on that little mini rant. Never mind, a rant about True Peaks is exactly where a webcast like this probably should come to a stop. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for taking part and for your great questions. Like I say, if mastering for streaming and loudness for streaming is something that you're wrestling with, hopefully the Mastering for Streaming Made Simple course could be exactly what you need. That was my intent when I made it. It's hosted on the Kajabi platform now, so you can ask questions that I can reply to after the videos. If I haven't quite nailed the description, I can add extra content in future if there's something that people need more clarity on. I really want this to be an invaluable resource and an affordable resource for people who are struggling with this stuff. Of course, I have other products that kind of go into the wider mastering thing in much more detail, but if online loudness is the thing that's bugging you, hopefully this is the course for you. So to find out more, please go to homemastering.com/MFS for Mastering for Streaming. Excuse me. And with that tickle in my throat, I think I will end the live stream. But thanks so much for being here. And as always, thanks for listening.